Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Empowering Muslim Women in Sacred Spaces, Reviving the Prophet's Forgotten Sunnah. This seminar takes as its starting point the 2015 ISNA Statement on the Inclusion of Women in Masjids, which calls for a recommitment to the prophetic ideal of mosques being open and friendly to women. That statement, which is included in your packets, reads in part, striving to realize the prophetic model, we call upon all masjids to ensure that 1, women are welcomed as an integral part of masjids and encouraged to attend. 2, women have a prayer space in the main musalla, which is behind the lines of men, but not behind a full barrier that disconnects women from the main musalla and prevents them from seeing the imam. And 3, women actively participate in the decision-making process of the masjid, best realized by having women on the governing bodies of masjids. The defining principle underlying this call is Allah's description of the ideal relationship between men and women in the Muslim community. The believing men and the believing women are awliya, supporters, helpers, protectors, patrons of one another. They both enjoin what is known to be good and forbid what is known to be bad. They establish salah and pay zakat, and they obey Allah and His Messenger. These are the ones on whom Allah will bestow mercy. Indeed, Allah is exalted in power, wise. To begin the process of realizing this vision, CAIR-Philadelphia has assembled this panel of some of the country's leading scholars on Islam and American Muslims. We will ask the panel to speak on some key issues that will help frame the afternoon session on broadly where we might go from here to change, to empower women in our sacred spaces. The questions are included in your packets, as I mentioned before, and should you wish to take notes on what the speakers are saying, I would suggest that you pull those questions so that you can remind yourself who is speaking to which question. So I'm just going to go over the agenda for today. In this initial session, we'll have a conversation with the seminar speakers. I'll introduce them for you briefly, and then I will pose a set of questions to the speakers one at a time, and then give them a chunk of time in which they can answer those questions in whatever way, in whichever order, with whichever emphasis they see fit. And then we will have a lengthy, probably hour to hour and a half long Q&A session where your questions can be directed to the panelists, all or whichever you'd like to address. I think what we're going to do is have you pose your questions from the floor, and I'll repeat them unless you're far in the back, in which case you are also welcome to come up and pose your question from the podium if you prefer. We'll break for Zuhr prayer and lunch at 12:45 until 1:45 p.m., and then we will begin our facilitated breakout sessions. That will last from 1:45 until 2:45, and then what we're going to do is spend an hour from those facilitated groups reading back our answers to the 3 central questions, the numbered questions that are posed. And again, those are in your packet. That's for the facilitated session again, the facilitated breakout session again. Finally, we'll complete Asr prayer together, and that will conclude our schedule for today. So I'm going to start by introducing our wonderful speakers today, starting from just next to me with Donna Austin, who is a doctoral candidate in the Department of Anthropology at Rutgers University. Her research interests include race, gender, and Islam in America. She has written and lectured widely on various aspects of the lived experience of African American Muslims. Her work has received coverage from national media outlets, including NBC News and the Huffington Post. Her editorials have appeared in Anthropology Now, Religion News Service, and the Washington Post. Iman Sultan is to her right. She is a student from your position to her left, is a student at Temple University studying journalism and political science. Sultan is the president of Students for Justice in Palestine at Temple University and also co-founded, the Muslima Project at Temple University. Dr. Jonathan Brown is the Al-Walid bin Talal Chair of Islamic Civilization in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. He is the director of the Al-Walid bin Talal Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding. Dr. Brown has been called the foremost scholar of hadith by the American Muslim academic Omid Safi. His most recent book, Misquoting Muhammad, The Challenges and Choices of Interpreting the Prophet's Legacy, was named one of the top books on religion in 2014 by The Independent. To his for you left, Dr. Sarah Sayeed is the executive director of Women in Islam Incorporated, a social justice and human rights volunteer organization dedicated to the empowerment of women through knowledge and practice of Islam. In this capacity, she helped author the booklet Women-Friendly Mosques and Community Centers, Reclaiming Our Heritage, and a survey report, Women and the American Mosque. And to her left, Dr. Mustafa Ahmed is the director of the Foundation for Islamic Education in Villanova, Pennsylvania. He is a scholar of and has published on a range of topics that are relevant to our discussion today, most notably Islamic jurisprudence and the verification of hadith. He has lectured on the topics of Islamic thought and Islam and modern science in locations around the world. Dr. Mustafa earned his PhD with distinction and honors in the history of Islamic jurisprudence from The Ohio State University. Join me in welcoming our panelists today. Thank you for coming. So, let me go ahead and pose several questions. If you wouldn't mind, Dr. Sayeed, I will pose some questions to you first. We've organized our questions to sort of set the stage so that we have a picture of what's happening in American mosques today, and then we go through some of the historical and Islamic foundations for what we perhaps ought to expect from or imagine in our mosques. So, Dr. Sayeed, generally speaking, we'd like to hear from you. What is the state of mosque access for women in the United States? And what are some of the biggest issues and challenges facing Muslim women seeking access to and inclusion in mosque activities? Specifically, what are the challenges, both social and organizational, that women face when trying to gain leadership positions on mosque boards? And how does the lack of a female presence in leadership affect mosque life? Now, this is going to sound like a whole lot of questions, but I'll just remind all of you that you have the questions in your packet, and Dr. Sayeed has the questions there in front of her as well. So again, there are a few more things we'd like you to address, including the ISNA statement on the inclusion of women in masjids. We'd like to hear what your experience has been of the support of religious scholars or community leaders for that statement, how effective that statement has been in shifting thus far the position of women in mosques. We'd like to hear from you on some of the social, religious, and economic factors that make it difficult to provide greater mosque space, so some of the obstacles that we face in changing the role of women in and the access of women to mosque space. And finally, one of the sort of critical pieces of the debate around women in mosque space. Sure. One of the critical obstacles or concerns in a lot of discussions around women in mosque space is that women themselves, Muslim women themselves, have a variety of perspectives on what they would like to see in mosque space. So there are women who would prefer a barrier, women who would not prefer a barrier, and so on. So if you could speak to how significant those concerns are and what effect those concerns have in the discussion around women in mosques.
Okay. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, great. I thought I'd start out with a story. In June, I started working for Mayor de Blasio in New York City in the Community Affairs Unit, and that is actually my full-time job. Women in Islam has been my passion and my work in the community for many, many years, but to get paid, I have to do other things. So I started working for the administration, and I am tasked with reaching out to Muslim communities in New York City, as well as advising the mayor and city agencies on creating culturally responsive programs and policies. It's the first time in New York City history that a Muslim community liaison exists in the mayor's office, and it's a privilege and an honor to serve in that role. One of the things that happened the first week that I was there is that the mayor was about to visit a mosque. I was not involved in planning that visit. However, as the Muslim community liaison, I was expected to show up and help to staff the mayor at the mosque visit. The sad part of this is that I was not allowed to enter the space where the mayor was going to give his remarks as a woman, because they had no space for women in the mosque. The other issue that came up is, or they had space for women, but it was in a separate space altogether, like on a different floor, and the entrance was like around the corner. The other issue that came up is we had a question, are women reporters going to be allowed in the mosque? Because whenever the mayor goes anywhere, part of what you want to do is publicize that visit so that people know this mayor is connecting with our community, and that Muslims know this mayor is connecting with our community. So you want to try to create an open press event, right? But again, women were not allowed in the area where the mayor would be speaking, so women reporters couldn't go in there. So the visit went ahead anyway, and it was a good visit. Good remarks were given. We actually gave an award to Lassana Bathily from France, who was involved in saving people in the Jewish supermarket. So that it was a great visit in a lot of other ways, but this is kind of the critical challenge that we are in as a Muslim community right now. We are at a time in history when it is crucially important for us to be engaging the larger world, for us to be educating people about who we are as Muslims. What is Islam about? And it's also very important for us to be civically engaged, to be engaged in interfaith work. But we have this problem across all states, all cities, and New York City is a very diverse, Muslim community is very diverse ethnically, culturally, and I personally think that this problem of women's access to the mosque is something that we must address across the country at this time for a variety of reasons. So what does the picture look like statistically? On average, 18% of mosque attendees are women, and 2/3 of mosques use dividers. This is something that hasn't changed since 2010, or 2000 rather, when the first survey was done, the National Survey of Mosques, and looking not just at women, but other areas as well. The other thing that we see across our communities is a difference in culture in terms of how this use of the barrier plays out. So mosques with imams who are American-born are less likely to use a divider. So 38% versus 78% of mosques overall. Also, mosques within the African-American Muslim community are less likely to use dividers. 39% of these mosques versus South Asian community mosques, which is 80%, and 70% for predominantly Arab community mosques. And dividers are least used among the Warithuddin community, which is 10% of mosques. And then one of the good things that's happening in mosques is that there are programs for women in many mosques, and it's a third of mosques that were in the survey had women's groups. And women's participation on the board is also, I think, doing okay, but definitely needs work. So between 2000 and 2011, there was an increase in the number of mosques that allowed women on the board. It went from like 50% to 59%. And there are also mosques that want women on their boards, but don't actually have women on their boards for a variety of reasons. We can talk about that. So 28% have space for women on their boards, but don't actually have women serving. And then a small percent of mosques do not allow women on their boards. That's 13%. Another thing that we see is that there is a dropping off in terms of young people, young professionals, as they kind of move out of the space of college and graduate school. There is a likelihood that they're not as engaged in the mosque space, and I think that that's part of the challenge here is that many people are coming into college, graduate school environments that are very diverse in terms of ethnicity, language, culture, gender, all of these things, religiosity, and the MSA is a space where those identities kind of come together. But when you come out into the real world, the mosque doesn't necessarily mirror that experience, and so people get very discouraged and don't want to continue in that environment. And also the other thing is that mosques are not doing a great job of programming for young professionals, right? So 17% of mosques actually offer programs for young adults, compared to, if you look at all faith groups, other faith groups, that's actually 69% of faith-based institutions offering programming for young professionals. Similarly, another thing that draws young people in is to have support groups in the mosque space. That's only 7% of mosques are doing that compared to 46% across other faith groups. And then the other thing that pulls in young people is community service opportunities, opportunities to engage with wider society. For us, as a Muslim community, 48% of our mosques are doing that compared to 87% overall. There are other things too, like team sports, youth groups, women's groups, that I think we can be doing a lot better with. So these are a bunch of numbers that I've thrown at you, and we need to look at what is the larger reality underlying these numbers. Why, are these numbers even a problem? Some people don't think they're a problem. Some people think that because women don't necessarily belong in the mosque on Fridays, and based on their cultural, experience from home, or even their understanding of, what Islam says, they don't think these numbers are an issue. And others, I think certainly all the people here, certainly organizations like Women in Islam and the Islamic Society of North America and many, many scholars do think that this is an area that we need to improve in. And I think we have to really think about what is the purpose of a mosque, right? Why is this institution important? And how are we fulfilling the purpose of a mosque as Americans, as Muslims living in America? And to answer the question of what's the purpose, it's to meet the community's need for spiritual nourishment, right? The mosque is our spiritual home, and it's meant to be a home to all the members of the Muslim community. And when we go to the mosque, when we go to our spiritual home, it is inviting us to enter a deeper spirituality, to focus on who we are in relationship to God. So that's the purpose of this space. And who's the God that we are relating to? This God is a God of divine mercy. It's a God of compassion, a God of justice, right? And unfortunately, for many people, many women, as well as other categories of people, there are few places that we can walk into a mosque and call it our spiritual home. Instead, when we go into the mosque, we experience oppression, we experience alienation, and we experience a lot of pain. And that pain has been accruing and accruing and accruing over the years. And Women in Islam, organizations like ours, have been interfacing with a lot of women who are sometimes articulating that pain, but a lot of times not. A lot of times holding it in. And in the name of, either being patient or, accommodating or internalizing, this kind of negative perception of who women are. And again, to come out of this, I think we need to go back to our faith. What does God say about oppression? We know that our teachings explicitly tell us that God hates oppression, right? And that we should not oppress one another. So let's look again. What is oppression within the Muslim context? What does dhulm mean? Islamically, everything and everyone that exists is defined in relation to God. That's our reality. We are created for a divine purpose, to serve God, to serve a compassionate, merciful, and just God. So whenever our self is aligned with God's purpose, that's seen as liberating and elevating to the soul. When it's not aligned, when we do something contrary to the guidelines of what God has given us, that is oppression, broadly speaking. And we also oppress ourselves all the time. Very simple thing that we do to oppress ourselves, we don't drink enough water every day. Like, our body is meant to be hydrated, right? That's a purpose that, that's a God-given gift that we have that we don't fulfill. So oppression it starts with the self, it's cyclical, it plays out all the time, gender, race, ethnicity, culture, you name it. I mean, it's all happening all the time, and we are all participants in it, a lot of times unconsciously, right? So I think part of the process of addressing this is really awakening to what we are doing and how we participate in these cycles. When we put women behind barriers in a mosque, we don't remember that we're doing something that the Prophet ﷺ never did. Never was a barrier in his mosque, right? And then when women ask to pray in the main prayer area, we don't realize somehow that they're asking to do something that the Prophet did, ﷺ, right? Instead, what we do is we create these categories of feminist, to kind of talk about this desire to pray in the main mosque area without a barrier. Or we say, oh, this is an issue of modesty. Like, why do you want that anyway, And questioning kind of the ulterior motive of women who want to pray in the main musalla without a barrier. So many challenges, right? One basic challenge we have is that we do not have religious knowledge. And it's not a lot of research that you need to do in order to understand that the way the Prophet ﷺ carried himself, conducted himself in the mosque, did not have a barrier in the mosque. Like, that doesn't require a lot of scholarship to know that. And we all know that, but for some reason, we're not able to kind of act on that knowledge. There is an over-reliance, I think, on culture, particularly for people who are coming to America from other cultures where women don't really go to the mosque very often. And these, behaviors and beliefs are kind of reenacted here. There's also, as I just mentioned, there's internalized oppression for both men and women. And we, I believe, have forgotten our divine purpose. And as you quoted the ayah in the beginning, our purpose really to help one another fulfill that divine purpose. I think that we have forgotten that. It's only the idea that an entire group of people, women, are a source of fitna, and disorder is only possible when you see them as serving something else other than God, right? It's just not possible. So I think that a lot of it is about reconnecting to our fundamental spiritual purpose here in life and using that to kind of move forward. There's also cognitive dissonance that a lot of us encounter in terms of entering a mosque space. We are out and about in the world, and whether it's in the classroom, in the workplace, in the public square, these are spaces that are very porous, very fluid. Women and men have, the same access to these spaces. And then when you walk into a mosque, all of a sudden it's a completely different environment, right? So that creates a cognitive dissonance in us that seeks, internally to be resolved. It's very hard for us, psychologically and mentally to live with that kind of dissonance and continue in that way. And I think this is another kind of burden on us as a community. So this lack of women being in the mosque is certainly impacting the spiritual thriving of the Muslim community here in America. Children don't have exposure to the mosque because women are not in the mosque. So the whole idea of how do you function in a mosque space? What is the adab of being in a masjid is not something that you can inculcate from a young age. And we don't feel spiritually supported. And we are just basically losing out, as a community. So in order to address this crisis, Women in Islam has been engaged in a very long time in this kind of challenge of how do we bring the entire Muslim community, or a critical mass of the Muslim community, to think about and center on this issue. And because of the deep beliefs that drive the behavior that we see manifest in our mosques, change takes a really long time, right? I've spent a lot of time thinking about health behavior change, right? It takes a long time for people to change behaviors like smoking, drinking, exercise. These are not things that you change overnight. And here we're talking about an entire mindset that is underlying the physical kind of, behaviors that we see. So the fact that, we published this booklet, over like 10 years ago, right? We're still we haven't changed that much, but to me that's not surprising. People get frustrated by this reality that it's taking a long time, but it's not surprising. It's not surprising because human beings don't like change. Just look at your own life, right? You are set in patterns in how you do things. How long does it take you on an individual level to change the things that you want to change about yourself? And yet we are asking an entire community to make this like groundswell of change so quickly. And it's just, psychologically, it's very difficult. It takes a lot of education, a lot of nurturing, a lot of collaboration, a lot of working across organizations. And that's the strategy that our organization has taken. People who are, more kind of on the progressive front get really frustrated by this approach. But this is the approach that we think brings the most people along and sticks to kind of the basics of what the Sunnah is, which is the Prophet ﷺ did not have a barrier in his mosque. And that's the place that we want to try to go to as a community. So this statement is, you should, if you haven't read it already, take a look at it and read it. It's in your folders. As we already mentioned, you read kind of 2 minutes left. Okay, you talked about the different things that are mentioned. We definitely are calling for prayer in the main musalla without a barrier, and also that we want women to participate more in the boards. And we want people to sign on to this. So one of the things you can do as an individual is go to your mosque leadership and community, wide here. You can get leaders to sign on to this statement, and that you can do that online. Effectiveness, how effective has this been? You can measure effectiveness in a variety of ways. One measure of effectiveness is it stimulating community conversations. So I think in a convening like this, that's a measure of the statement being effective, because we're getting together and talking about it more. Is it promoting, education on the issue of women in the masjid? And I think that's also happening. And what the ultimate kind of measure of effectiveness is, how does it actually change mosques and what people are doing in mosques? And for that to happen, it takes a really grassroots strategy, right? People have to come together at their mosque and figure out what's going on in that space and how do we develop a realistic agenda for change. You asked that, just to finally address that question of like the variety of views that we have as a community about how we should be practicing, gender inclusion, women inclusion in the mosque space. I think there's a real need here and a vacuum that must be filled for scholars to step in. Frankly, there's a lot more that our scholars can be doing on this area. One of the things that they need to clarify is what is the relationship of fiqh to culture, right? Because the Quran and Sunnah exist, but their interpretations were derived in a cultural context. The Prophet ﷺ practiced Islam in a cultural context, right? What are the similarities between the cultures that gave rise to the practice of Islam and the culture that we're living in as Americans? That's something scholars can explain to us. Is there a fiqh position that is more appropriate for the North American cultural context than other positions? Like, that's something that I think we need to hear more about. And I think that we also have to be asking people who want to have these kinds of barriers, is the mosque really ready to have women and men together, and young people. And what are we losing as a community if we don't include everyone in the masjid? If not, if people who are new Muslims don't feel able to walk into a mosque space, what are we losing, right? What are we losing if women are giving their talents to nonprofit organizations, government, professionals, the corporate sector, but they're not able to channel these amazing talents to the thriving of our mosques? What are we losing as a community? And we just need to be paying attention to how the presence of women in the mosque is going to increase the vibrancy of our institutions. It's going to gain us more institutional supporters, because women do have money. They can contribute. They can be donors. And it's going to overall help our community to be a lot more dynamic. And the Prophet's example, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, is always something that we should be striving to emulate. And inshallah, we can continue in this path and we can continue to grow. My dua is we can continue to come into awareness and mutual education and learning and support, and that we do inculcate in our hearts a lot of patience, not just with one another, but with ourselves, because we have personally and collectively have a lot of unlearning and relearning to do. Thank you.